This video is on Chapter 4 of Mill's Utilitarianism, and this is for our Philosophy 2310 Theory of Ethics class here at Marquette University. I'm Richard Taylor. So let's proceed. Chapter 4, the title of Chapter 4 is Of What Sort of Proof the Principle of Utility is Susceptible. That is, how do we prove it? What kind of proof can be provided of it? And Mill is very clear. He says, quote, "The utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end." Now that's true, but he's going to make a number of important qualifications in this chapter. So let's proceed. The one thing he does say for sure, and this is really the essence of it, of his answer to the question, although he's got some very interesting material that comes after this. He says, well, what sort of proof? Well, he says the sole evidence it's possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually desire it. So there's the proof. What's the proof of utilitarianism? That people desire it. They desire the greatest good for the greatest number. But of course, they desire more than that. In fact, while Mill says that the mantra continues to be the case, continues to be said here, greatest good for greatest number, where good indicates pleasure, there's something more than just pleasure involved, and there is a kind of pleasure that we get that is very special to us as social animals. And so it isn't just pleasure in the most crass sense, but a more complex sense of social pleasure that's going to come out here. And this is what I referred to in the previous video as the role that Hume plays in the thought of Mill here with regard to the notion of sentiment or feeling and the natural feelings that human beings have. So while in earlier parts, an earlier video, there was a stress that utilitarianism is not innate, but it's trained into young people. But it's still, in a sense, natural. Well, it's naturally able to be trained into people, and that's his assertion. So it isn't that we're naturally seekers of pleasure and the greatest good for the greatest number, but rather this will be trained into us, that we should set aside our own good for the sake of the greater good of others. But this is something trained in us, and it's trained in us in a way that we come to want that, the greatest good for the greatest number, even over our own particular happiness. And he explains it further in this, so let's continue with chapter 4. So, he says, however, happiness is not the sole thing that people in fact desire. Now it seemed that with the notion of the greatest good for the greatest number, and that people are mainly seeking happiness, but he makes some qualifications here that are very important. He says, quote, happiness has made out its title as one of the ends or goals of conduct, and consequently one of the criteria of morality. But it has not, by this alone, proved itself to be the sole criterion. To do that, it would seem, by the same rule, necessary to show not only that people desire happiness, but they never desire anything else. That's more. Okay, that's more. So he's going to have to qualify this. That's what he's doing now, and he's going to explain it. Of course, people, pardon me. Of course, people desire money, but that's only part of it. And besides, money, as we saw with Aristotle, is only a means to happiness and means to pleasure. And of course, for Aristotle, happiness was a much more complex notion, a notion of fulfillment. Mill's doing something a bit different here, as we've seen already. So among the goods that people desire is something called virtue. And it's connected with the social context that we find ourselves in and the social feelings. So among the goods people desire is virtue, something which nature has us regard as greater than primitive pleasures. So we think moral virtues and the excellence of character is more important than eating lots of pizzas or the primitive pleasures. So it's another important pleasure for Mill. He goes on to say this, there was no original desire for it or motive to it, save its conduciveness to pleasure, and especially to protection from pain. So originally, that's it. That's why we wanted virtue. It gets us pleasure and protects us from pain. But he goes on to say, But through the association thus formed, it may be felt a good in itself, and desired as such, desired as such, with as great intensity as any other good. So we can develop this notion of virtue, and we really want virtue or excellence of character, and we may desire it and regard it as a very high good, with as much intensity as any other good. And with this difference, he continues, between it and the love of money or of power or of fame, that all of these may and often do render the individual noxious to other members of the society to which he belongs, whereas there is nothing which makes him so much a blessing to them as the cultivation of disinterested love of virtue. That is, love of virtue, the development in oneself of the love of virtue without any self-interest in it, but to love virtue because it's virtuous, to be excellent as a moral person just because one wants to be excellent as a moral person. But notice the language, it's a cultivation of this. So eventually, this is something that is brought about inside us. And he says, but through the association thus formed, it may be felt a good in itself. And that's what he's talking about. So virtue becomes a good in itself for Mill. Then he goes on, consequently, the utilitarian standard, greatest good for greatest number, enjoins and requires the cultivation of the love of virtue, up to the greatest strength possible, as being above all things important to the general happiness. So this is what utilitarianism does. It stresses that it's important to the general happiness, greatest good for greatest number, remember, that requires this, and we cultivate this, and we cultivate it, we grow it, so to speak, in ourselves and in our children and others in society, and we praise them for being virtuous. And this is essential to the general happiness, which is what utilitarianism is all about. Not the individual happiness now, but the general happiness. So the answer to the question of the proof of the principle of utility is indicated on the top of page 37-38 in our books. Quote, we have now an answer to the question of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. If the opinion which I have now stated is psychologically true, if human nature is so constituted as to desire nothing which is not either a part of happiness or a means of happiness, we have no other proof, and we require none other, that these are the only things desirable. He goes on, the quotation continues, if so, happiness is the sole end or goal of human action, and the promotion of it is the test by which to judge of all human conduct. And the promotion of it, the test by which to judge all human conduct. So if we promote happiness, then we are people of good conduct. He goes on, from whence it necessarily follows that it must be the criterion of morality, since a part is included in the whole. So that's it. This is an essential part of it, then, the development of virtue and character. The evidence, then, is that human beings desire pleasure and avoid pain. That's it. And so happiness is our sole end. But virtue becomes part of it because it's trained into us to be virtuous. So key in the understanding of this is the relationship between will and desire. And he has a very interesting account here. I think it's really very, very helpful to distinguish will and desire, and then to show their interaction and how the interaction changes from the time when we are children to when we become adults. When we're children, our will is controlled by our desire. We desire the cookie, and then we will to have the cookie because we desired it. But as we grow older, we're able to control our desires, and then we are no longer controlled by the desires, but rather we determine which desires are the ones that we will allow into our lives. And so we make various promises and vows, such as wedding vows and many others, and now we are the ones who control desire. We decide what desires, wants, and needs are appropriate or not. That happens with maturity and education. So as a child, then desire controlled will, but as an adult, will controls desire. So here's what he says. Will, the active phenomenon, is a different thing from desire. the state of passive sensibility, and though originally an offshoot from it, may in time take root and detach itself from the parent stock. That is, will may separate off from desire. So much so that in the case of habitual purpose, instead of willing the thing because we desire it, we often desire it only because we will it. So we get our desires in order under the control of our reason and our will. We've already seen that with regard to Aristotle and Kant. He goes on to say, quote, how can the will to be virtuous, where it does not exist in sufficient force, be implanted or awakened? How do we bring it about in people? He says, only by making the person desire virtue, by making him think of it as in a pleasurable light, or its absence in a painful one. Of course, we do that in society. We encourage and teach this sort of thing. It is by associating the doing right with pleasure and the wrong with pain, or by eliciting and impressing and bringing home to the person's experience the pleasure naturally involved in the one or the pain in the other, that it is possible to call forth that will to be virtuous, which when confirmed acts without any thought of either pleasure or pain. This last part he's saying is that once we get this inside ourselves and we realize the value of virtue, then we don't do virtuous things for the sake of pleasure and pain, but we take pleasure in the virtuous thing itself. We take pleasure in being virtuous. So he says on page 39, will is the child of desire. That is, it comes out of desire and passes out of the dominion of its parent only to come under that of habit. So habit will now control desire, and will play an important role in this, but will no longer, thanks to habitual willing, will no longer be controlled by our desires. So it's in this context that habit plays a central role, and he says this, both in feeling and in conduct, habit is the only thing which imparts certainty. So it has firmness and certainty because we've used habits with regard to what feelings are right or wrong and with which conduct is right or wrong. And it's because of the importance to others of being able to rely absolutely on one's feelings and conduct, and to oneself of being able to rely on one's own, that the will to do right ought to be cultivated into this habitual independence. That is, we develop through habit the right form of character, and that character is a virtuous character. We saw this in Aristotle as well. So he goes on to say then on page 40, in other words, this state of the will is a means to good, not intrinsically good. So we put ourselves in that virtuous state, and it's a means to good, but not intrinsically a good, and does not contradict the doctrine that nothing is good to human beings but insofar as it is either in self-pleasurable or a means of attaining pleasure or averting pain. His point is then that in fact we get pleasure out of this. We get pleasure out of being virtuous and being seen to be virtuous. So we enjoy being the social animals we are. So this is part of the notion that's somewhat suppressed in Mill, but it's there, that the importance of being in society, being social animals, and the feelings that we get from that, and the pleasures we get from being able to feel ourselves to be part of the social group. This is an important motivating factor. Okay, that's all for chapter 4, and I'll stop here.